The lecture hall at Riverside University was one of those old buildings that seemed to echo with decades of academic pressure. Row after row of wooden seats climbed up toward the back, and that's exactly where she preferred to sit. Always the last row, always by the window, always alone. Her name was Claire Rodriguez, and if you looked at her, you'd never guess what was going on inside her head. She was 28 years old, dressed in simple jeans and a plain sweater that had seen better days. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she carried a backpack that looked like it had survived a war. Nothing about her screamed, "Look at me." In fact, everything about her whispered, "Please don't." The advanced calculus class was supposed to be one of the toughest courses at the university. Students called it the weeder because it separated those who truly understood mathematics from those who just thought they did. And the man who taught it was legendary for all the wrong reasons. Professor Douglas Brennan stood at the front of the room like he owned not just the classroom but the entire concept of mathematics itself. He was in his mid-50s with graying hair and glasses that he had a habit of peering over when he wanted to make someone feel small. And he was very, very good at making people feel small. Mathematics, he would often say, is not for everyone. Some people simply lack the mental capacity for true abstract thought. He said this with the kind of confidence that made students wonder if maybe he was right. Maybe they really weren't smart enough. Claire had heard all of this before. She'd been sitting in his class for 3 weeks now, taking notes, doing the assignments, and staying completely invisible. Or at least she was trying to stay invisible. But in a class of about 40 students, being the quiet one in the back sometimes made you stand out even more. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, she would walk into that lecture hall, take her seat, and watch as Professor Brennan performed his teaching style, which was less about helping students learn and more about proving how brilliant he was. He would write complex equations on the board with a flourish, explain them in ways that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify, and then call on students randomly to solve problems at the board. This last part was what everyone feared most. Getting called to the board by Professor Brennan was like being thrown into an arena with a hungry lion. He wouldn't just let you struggle with a problem. He would stand there, arms crossed, making comments as you worked. "Is that really the approach you're taking?" Or, "Interesting choice, though I can't imagine why you'd do that," or his personal favorite, "Please continue. I'm curious to see where this disaster leads." Claire had watched student after student walk to that board and crumble under the pressure. Some would actually start crying. Others would just stand there frozen until Professor Brennan would sigh dramatically and say, "Sit down. Clearly this is beyond you. It was brutal. It was mean." And Claire suspected it was completely unnecessary, but she kept her head down, took her notes, and hoped he would never notice her. What Professor Brennan didn't know, what nobody in that classroom knew, was that Claire had a secret. It wasn't a dramatic secret or a dangerous one. It was simply this. She was probably the best mathematician in that room. Maybe in the whole building. Possibly one of the best young mathematicians in the entire country. But she didn't look like it. She didn't act like it. And she certainly didn't advertise it. 6 years ago, Claire's life had taken an unexpected turn. Her parents died in a car accident, leaving her as the guardian of her 2 younger brothers. Just like that, at 22, she went from being a promising math student at a prestigious university to being a full-time caregiver working 2 jobs to keep her family afloat. She dropped out of school. She had to. There was no other choice. Her brothers needed food, housing, stability. They needed someone to help them with homework and make sure they got to school on time. They needed her more than she needed a degree, but Claire never stopped learning. She couldn't. Mathematics wasn't just something she studied. It was how her brain worked. It was how she understood the world. So late at night, after her brothers went to bed, after she'd finished her shift at the diner and checked all the homework and paid whatever bills she could, she would open her old textbooks and teach herself. She started with where she'd left off and then kept going. Advanced calculus, differential equations, real analysis, mathematical physics. She learned from textbooks, from online lectures, from academic papers she could access for free. And somewhere along the way, she started solving problems that even the textbooks didn't have answers to. She began writing papers. Just for herself at first because she had to get the ideas out of her head. But then she started submitting them to academic journals, using just her initials so nobody would have preconceptions. And they got published. Not in small journals either. Real, prestigious publications that actual mathematicians read. By the time her brothers were old enough to be more independent, Claire had published 7 papers on various applications of calculus. She'd solved problems that had stumped researchers. She'd developed new approaches to old equations. And she'd done it all while serving coffee and waiting tables and making sure 2 teenage boys didn't burn down the house. Now those brothers were in college themselves, thanks to scholarships and Claire's careful planning. And finally, she could come back to finish her own degree. Not because she needed to learn the material. She'd learned it all on her own. But because the world didn't care what you knew if you didn't have the paper to prove it. Research institutions wouldn't hire her without a degree. No matter how many papers she'd published, no matter how brilliant her work was, they wanted to see that official stamp of approval. So here she was, sitting in classes where she already knew everything being taught, just so she could get that piece of paper that said she was qualified. It was frustrating. It was exhausting. And sitting in Professor Brennan's class, watching him treat students like they were stupid, made it even worse. But she told herself to be patient. Just get through it. Don't make waves. Don't draw attention. Get the degree and get out. But Professor Brennan had other ideas. He'd noticed her, sitting there quietly in the back, never participating, never raising her hand. To him, she looked like someone who was lost. Someone who probably didn't belong in an advanced class. Someone who was just taking up space. He'd seen students like her before, he thought. Older students who came back to school thinking their life experience would make up for lack of ability. They never lasted. They always dropped out eventually, and he took a certain satisfaction in being the one who revealed to them that they weren't cut out for serious academics. As Claire sat there that Thursday morning, copying down equations and already knowing 3 different ways to solve each one, she had no idea that everything was about to change. She had no idea that Professor Brennan had noticed her. And she definitely had no idea that he'd decided she would be his next example. She just kept taking notes, staying quiet, and counting down the days until she could finally move on with her life. But sometimes staying quiet only works for so long. Sometimes the universe has other plans. And sometimes the person trying to humiliate you has absolutely no idea who they're dealing with. It was a Tuesday morning, and the weather outside matched the mood inside the lecture hall. Gray, cold, and unwelcoming. Claire walked in with her usual coffee from the campus cafe, the cheapest one they sold because she still watched every dollar, even though things were better now than they'd been in years. She climbed the stairs to her usual spot in the back row and settled in, pulling out her notebook and her mechanical pencil. The classroom was filling up slowly. Some students chatted nervously, probably about the exam coming up next week. Others looked half asleep. Nobody paid any attention to Claire, which was exactly how she liked it. Professor Brennan strode in exactly at 9 o'clock, like he always did. Punctuality was one of his things. He believed it showed discipline and respect for the material. Of course, he didn't seem to think being respectful to his students was equally important. But that was a different matter. "Good morning," he said, though his tone suggested he didn't actually care whether it was good or not. "Today we're going to discuss differential equations, specifically those that apply to real-world physics problems. Some of you will find this challenging. Most of you will find it nearly impossible. That's to be expected." He turned to the board and began writing out an equation. It was complex, involving multiple variables and requiring several steps to solve. Claire recognized it immediately. It was a classic problem involving wave motion, though he'd added some complications to make it harder. As he wrote, Professor Brennan talked through the problem. Imagine you're calculating the motion of a wave through different mediums where the density changes. This is the kind of problem that separates those who truly understand calculus from those who merely memorize formulas. He finished writing and turned back to face the class, his eyes scanning the rows of students. Claire felt a tiny twinge of something. Warning, maybe. She kept her eyes on her notebook, hoping he'd call on one of the students who always raised their hands, the ones who liked to show off. But the universe wasn't feeling merciful that day. "Ms. Rodriguez," his voice cut through the air like a knife. "Perhaps you'd like to come up and show us how to solve this problem." Claire's stomach dropped. Around her, students turned to look, trying to figure out who he was talking about. Most of them didn't even know her name. She'd been that invisible. She looked up and found Professor Brennan staring directly at her, a slight smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes. It was the kind of smile a cat might give a mouse before pouncing. "I've noticed you've been very quiet in my class, Ms. Rodriguez," he continued. "You never participate in discussions. You never ask questions. I'm beginning to wonder if you're actually following along or if you're simply lost and too embarrassed to admit it." The classroom went completely silent. Everyone was looking at her now. Claire felt her face getting warm. She hated this. Hated being the center of attention. Hated confrontation. This was exactly what she'd been trying to avoid for 3 weeks. She could just say no. She could tell him she didn't want to come up to the board. But that would only make things worse. He'd probably say something about her being afraid or unwilling to try. And then everyone would really think she didn't belong there. So she did the only thing she could do. She closed her notebook, stood up, and walked down the stairs to the front of the room. Every step felt like it took forever. She could feel 40 pairs of eyes on her back. When she reached the board, Professor Brennan handed her a piece of chalk with that same cold smile. "Take your time," he said, but his tone made it clear he expected her to fail. "We're all very interested to see your approach." He stepped back and crossed his arms, waiting. A few students in the front row exchanged glances. They'd seen this before. They knew what was coming. Professor Brennan had found his target for the day, and now he'd pick apart whatever she did until she gave up. Claire stood there for a moment, looking at the equation on the board. Her heart was pounding, but not because the problem was difficult. It wasn't. She could solve it in her sleep. She was nervous because she knew that solving it would change things. It would draw attention. It would make her visible. And visibility was dangerous, but she was already at the board. There was no backing down now, so she took a breath and started writing. She began by identifying the type of differential equation they were working with and stating the method she'd use to solve it. Her handwriting was neat and clear as she worked through the first steps, breaking down the problem into manageable pieces. Professor Brennan watched with his arms still crossed, waiting for her to make a mistake. But Claire didn't make mistakes. Not with math. She moved through the equation methodically, showing each step clearly. She integrated, she substituted, she simplified. The other students started to lean forward in their seats. This wasn't what they'd expected. She wasn't fumbling or hesitating. She was moving through the problem with quiet confidence like she'd done it 100 times before. And then Claire did something that made Professor Brennan's eyebrows rise. Instead of using the standard method that he'd been teaching, she applied a different approach. It was more elegant, more efficient. It was the kind of technique you'd only know if you'd really studied advanced applications, not just followed a textbook. She worked through the calculations, her chalk making small clicking sounds against the board. The equation transformed under her hand, becoming simpler and simpler until finally she arrived at the solution. She wrote it clearly, double-checked her work, and then stepped back. The room was dead silent. Claire turned to look at Professor Brennan, waiting for him to say something. His face had gone through several expressions in the last few minutes. First confusion, then surprise, then something that might have been annoyance or disbelief. He walked up to the board and studied what she'd written. He checked each step carefully, looking for errors, looking for anything he could criticize. But there was nothing. The solution was perfect. More than perfect. It was actually better than the way he would have solved it. He started, then stopped. He seemed to be struggling with what to say. He'd obviously expected her to fail, to give him a chance to lecture about the importance of attending to the material. But she hadn't failed. She'd succeeded brilliantly. "This is adequate," he finally said, his voice tight. "Though I'm not sure where you learned this particular approach. It's not in the textbook." "No, sir," Claire said quietly. "It's not." She didn't elaborate. She didn't explain that she'd learned it from an advanced paper published 3 years ago, or that she'd actually used this exact technique in one of her own published works. She just stood there waiting to be dismissed. Professor Brennan waved his hand. "You can return to your seat." Claire walked back up to the back row, her legs feeling shaky now that the adrenaline was wearing off. She could hear whispers as she passed. Students were talking about what had just happened. The quiet girl from the back row had just solved one of Professor Brennan's impossible problems like it was nothing. When she sat down, the girl next to her, someone she'd never spoken to before, leaned over and whispered, "That was amazing. Where did you learn to do that?" Claire just shook her head slightly and opened her notebook again. She didn't want to talk about it. She wanted to go back to being invisible. But at the front of the room, Professor Brennan was already writing another equation on the board. This one was even harder than the first, and Claire had a sinking feeling that her quiet days in this class were over. "Now," Professor Brennan said, his voice carrying a new edge, "let's see if anyone else can demonstrate this level of competence." Or was that just a lucky guess, Ms. Rodriguez? He didn't call on her again that day, but Claire knew this wasn't over. She'd seen the look on his face when she solved that problem. It wasn't respect or appreciation. It was challenge. She'd somehow threatened him by being good at the thing he was supposed to be the master of. As the class ended and students filed out, Claire packed her bag slowly, hoping to avoid any conversations. But she couldn't avoid the feeling that she'd just made a terrible mistake. She'd shown what she could do, and now Professor Brennan knew she wasn't the struggling student he'd assumed she was. And men like Professor Brennan, men who built their reputation on being the smartest person in the room, didn't like being proven wrong. They especially didn't like being proven wrong by someone they'd already decided to look down on. Claire walked out into the gray morning, pulling her jacket tighter against the cold. She had 3 more months of this class. 3 more months of sitting in that room with a professor who now saw her as either a threat or a puzzle to be solved. She'd come back to school for a quiet degree, a simple path to the credentials she needed. But something told her that quiet wasn't an option anymore. Professor Brennan had noticed her now, and that meant everything was about to get a lot more complicated. The breakthrough came on a Wednesday afternoon, though Claire wouldn't know about it until later. She'd stayed after class to ask Professor Brennan a question about the homework assignment. Not because she didn't understand it, but because one of the problems seemed to have a typo that made it unsolvable. She wanted to check before spending hours on something that might be wrong. The lecture hall was empty except for the 2 of them. Professor Brennan was erasing the board, and Claire noticed he'd left some equations up in the corner. They weren't from today's lecture. They looked like something he'd been working on personally. "Professor Brennan," she said, approaching his desk. "About problem 7 on the assignment." "What about it?" he said without looking up from the papers he was organizing. "I think there might be an error in the boundary conditions. The way it's written, the equation doesn't have a stable solution." He looked up sharply. "The problem is fine, Ms. Rodriguez. Perhaps you're approaching it incorrectly." Claire bit her tongue. She knew she wasn't approaching it incorrectly. The problem was flawed, but arguing with him seemed pointless. "Okay," she said. "I'll keep working on it." As she turned to leave, her eyes caught those equations on the board again. She recognized them. They were related to fluid dynamics, specifically the movement of fluids through changing pressures. It was complex work, the kind of thing that might be part of a research paper. She almost said something but stopped herself. It wasn't her business. She left the lecture hall and headed home, trying to put the interaction out of her mind. What Claire didn't know was that those equations on the board were driving Professor Brennan crazy. He was preparing for the annual Mathematics Department Conference, a prestigious event where professors presented their latest research. He'd been working on a paper about fluid dynamics for months, but he'd hit a wall. The equations wouldn't resolve the way he needed them to. There was something wrong with his approach, but he couldn't figure out what. He'd spent weeks on it. Consulted textbooks, reviewed literature, tried different methods. Nothing worked, and the conference was only 6 weeks away. He needed this presentation. His department chair would be there. Researchers from major universities would be there. This was supposed to be his big moment, showing that he wasn't just a teacher but a real mathematician doing cutting-edge work. The next day, Claire arrived early to class. The building was quiet, most students still sleeping or getting coffee. She liked these early morning moments when campus felt peaceful. She climbed the stairs to the lecture hall, thinking she'd review her notes before class started. But when she pushed open the door, she found Professor Brennan already there, standing at the board with those same equations written out. He was just staring at them, his hand holding a piece of chalk, his expression frustrated. "Sorry," Claire said quickly. "I didn't know anyone would be here." "It's fine," he said absently, still looking at the board. Then he seemed to remember who he was talking to, and his face shifted into that familiar cold expression. "You're here early." "I like to review before class," Claire said. She should have just turned around and left, but something made her stay. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the part of her that couldn't resist a good math problem. She looked at the equations on the board more carefully. "Is that for research?" she asked. Professor Brennan hesitated like he was deciding whether to answer. Yes, he finally said. A paper on fluid dynamics. Applications to engineering problems. Claire nodded slowly. She could see the issue now. He was using a direct approach to the boundary conditions, but the problem needed a different method. The Lagrangian framework would work much better here, especially with modified conditions that accounted for the pressure variations. She'd actually dealt with a very similar problem in one of her papers. Different application, same underlying mathematics. It had taken her weeks to figure out, but once she'd found the right approach, everything fell into place. Have you tried? She started, then stopped. What was she doing? This was his research. He wasn't asking for her help. And based on how he'd been treating her, he probably didn't want it. But Professor Brennan had turned to look at her. Have I tried what? Claire shook her head. Nothing. Never mind. No, he said, and there was something different in his voice. Not the usual condescending tone. Something more genuine. If you have an idea, I'm listening, Claire wavered. This could go badly. He could mock her suggestion, or he could get angry that she was presuming to help him. But she looked at those equations and she couldn't help herself. Mathematics was mathematics. Personal feelings didn't change what worked and what didn't. The boundary conditions, she said carefully. You're treating them as fixed values, but the problem might need them to be variable. If you use a Lagrangian approach and modify the conditions to account for the pressure gradients, it might resolve differently. Professor Brennan turned back to the board, studying what he'd written. A Lagrangian approach, he repeated. That would change the entire framework. It would, Claire agreed. But it might give you the stability you need for a solution. He was quiet for a long moment, just looking at the equations. Then he said, And I suppose you just happen to know this off the top of your head? There was skepticism in his voice, but also something else. Curiosity, maybe. Claire took a breath. I've seen a similar problem before. In a journal. The approach worked for that case. It might work for yours. What journal? Here it was. The moment she'd been avoiding. Journal of Applied Mathematics, Claire said. Volume 47, Issue 3. Professor Brennan walked over to his desk and pulled out his laptop. He typed for a moment, then waited while the page loaded. Claire watched his face as he read whatever came up on the screen. His expression went from curious to confused to completely shocked. This paper, he said slowly, is authored by E.M. Rodriguez. Claire didn't say anything. What could she say? Professor Brennan looked up at her, then back at the screen, then at her again. E.M. Rodriguez, Claire M. Rodriguez, that's you. Yes, Claire said quietly. He scrolled through the paper, reading. Claire could see his eyes moving rapidly across the screen, taking in the equations, the methodology, the results. It was a good paper. She knew it was. It had been cited 17 times by other researchers. It had opened up new approaches to solving problems that had previously been considered too complex. You wrote this, Professor Brennan said, and it wasn't a question. It was a statement of disbelief. You wrote this paper that's been cited by some of the leading researchers in applied mathematics. Yes. He scrolled some more. This was published 3 years ago. You would have been, 25? Yes, and you weren't in school then. Your records show you only returned to university this year. I taught myself, Claire said simply. I worked and took care of my family, and I taught myself mathematics. At night, on my own. Professor Brennan sat down heavily in his chair, still staring at the screen. He clicked on something else. You've published other papers. 7 total, Claire confirmed. 7 papers, he repeated like he couldn't quite believe it. Published in major journals. While you were working full-time. While you were... He trailed off, then looked up at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Why didn't you say something? Claire almost laughed, but it came out bitter. When? When you were calling me to the board to humiliate me. When you were making comments about mature students lacking natural aptitude. When exactly should I have mentioned that I've probably published more research than half the professors in this building? Professor Brennan's face went pale. He looked back at the screen, at her papers, at the citations and the praise from other mathematicians. Then he looked at the equations still on the board, the ones he'd been struggling with for weeks. The approach you suggested, he said quietly. You've used it before. In a different context, Claire said. But yes, it worked. He stood up and walked back to the board, looking at the equations with new eyes. If I apply your method here, he started writing, working through the modification she'd suggested. Claire watched as he transformed the equations step by step, using the Lagrangian framework with variable boundary conditions. And it worked. She could see the moment he realized it, the way his hand paused mid-calculation, the way his shoulders straightened. The equations were resolving. The solution was becoming stable. The problem that had plagued him for weeks was solving itself with her approach. He finished the calculation and just stood there, staring at the board. Then he turned to look at Claire, and his expression was completely different from anything she'd seen before. There was no condescension, no superiority, just genuine uncomfortable shame. He started, then stopped. Started again. Ms. Rodriguez, I owe you an apology. A profound apology. I've treated you abominably. I made assumptions about you based on nothing but my own arrogance and prejudice. Claire didn't know what to say. She'd imagined this moment, dreamed about him realizing he was wrong, but now that it was happening, she felt strangely empty. Professor Brennan continued, I thought you were struggling. I thought you didn't belong in my class. And instead He gestured helplessly at the laptop screen, at her papers, at the solution on the board. You're extraordinary. You're doing work that most mathematicians dream of doing. I just needed the degree, Claire said. That's all. I just needed the official credentials so institutions would take me seriously. And instead of helping you, Professor Brennan said, I've spent weeks trying to prove you weren't good enough. He sat back down, looking older somehow, tired. I've been teaching for 20 years, and I've never been more wrong about a student. The door opened and other students started arriving for class. The moment broke, reality flooding back in. Kevin walked in, saw Claire standing at the front with Professor Brennan and gave her a questioning look. She shook her head slightly, telling him it was okay. Professor Brennan cleared his throat. Ms. Rodriguez, could you stay after class today? I'd like to discuss something with you. Okay, Claire said and went back to her seat. The lecture that day was different. Professor Brennan didn't call on her once. He taught normally, explained clearly, answered questions patiently. And several times Claire caught him glancing back at her with an expression that looked like regret. When class ended and everyone filed out, Claire walked back down to the front. Professor Brennan was at his desk and he'd printed out something. Professor Brennan had printed out all 7 of Claire's papers. They sat on his desk in a neat stack, and she could see he'd made notes in the margins. He'd actually read them, really read them, not just skimmed. Sit down, please, he said, gesturing to a chair. His voice was different now, quieter, more human. Claire sat, her backpack still on her shoulder, ready to leave at any moment. She still didn't trust this new version of Professor Brennan. People didn't change overnight. I spent most of last night reading your work, he said. All of it. Every paper. Every proof. Every application. He paused, looking at her directly. Ms. Rodriguez, your work on multivariable calculus applications is some of the most innovative thinking I've seen in years. The paper on signal processing alone should have gotten more attention than it did. It got enough, Claire said. 17 citations. For someone working alone with no institutional backing, that's pretty good. It's exceptional, Professor Brennan corrected. And that's my point. You did this alone. No research team, no university resources, no mentorship, just you and your mind and determination. He leaned back in his chair. I've had every advantage in my career. Top universities, research grants, talented colleagues, and I'm not sure I've contributed as much to the field as you have. Claire didn't know how to respond to that. Part of her wanted to argue, to downplay her achievements the way she'd learned to do over the years. But another part of her, the part that had spent countless late nights working through impossible problems, felt a surge of pride. She'd earned this recognition. The conference is in 5 weeks, Professor Brennan continued. The annual mathematics department conference. I've been invited to present a paper, and honestly, without your insight, I would have had to withdraw. The work wasn't coming together. He picked up one of her papers. But now I'm thinking about something different. What if we presented together? Claire blinked. Together? Your methodology, properly applied to fluid dynamics problems, could be revolutionary. It deserves a wider audience. And he hesitated. I would be honored to help you present it. To give you the platform you've earned. It was tempting. The conference was prestigious. Having her work presented there could open doors. But Claire had learned to be cautious about offers that seemed too good. Why? She asked bluntly. Why would you want to help me now? Professor Brennan was quiet for a long moment. Because I've been a terrible teacher, he said finally. Not just to you, to all my students. I've been so focused on proving my own intelligence that I forgot the whole point of teaching is to nurture intelligence in others. You sat in my class for weeks watching me belittle students, and you stayed quiet even though you could have destroyed every assumption I made. I just wanted to get through the semester, Claire said. I know, and instead of making that easy for you, I made it as difficult as possible. Because my ego couldn't handle that someone I'd dismissed might actually be brilliant. He looked down at his hands. I've been thinking a lot about why I teach. I got into this because I love mathematics. I love the elegance of it, the way it explains the universe. But somewhere along the way, I started loving being right more than I loved the math itself. Claire watched him carefully. This vulnerability seemed genuine, but she'd been disappointed by people before. What are you really asking me, she said. Do you want me to co-present so you look good? So people think you mentored some brilliant student? No, Professor Brennan said firmly. I want to co-present because your work deserves recognition, and I can give you access to that audience. Will it reflect well on me? Probably. Will it make me feel less guilty about how I've treated you? Maybe a little. But mainly, Ms. Rodriguez, I'm asking because it's the right thing to do, and because I genuinely believe your approach could change how we think about these problems. Claire looked at the stack of papers on his desk, her papers, printed and annotated. She thought about all those late nights, working alone with nobody to discuss her ideas with. She thought about submitting papers and waiting months for responses, never knowing if anyone even cared about what she was doing. I'll think about it, she said. That's fair, Professor Brennan said. He pulled out another sheet of paper. There's something else. I spoke with the department chair this morning. We'd like to offer you a position as a teaching assistant for the undergraduate calculus courses. It's paid, and it would give you teaching experience for your resume. I don't need teaching experience, Claire said. I need research credentials. Then consider it research funding, he said. The pay isn't much, but it's something. And it would give you access to the university's research facilities. The library databases, the computing resources, everything you've been doing without. That was harder to refuse. Claire had been working with limited resources for years, making do with whatever she could access for free online. Having proper database access alone would be incredible. I'll think about that too, she said. Over the next week, things in class changed dramatically. Professor Brennan still called on Claire, but now it was in the context of asking her to share approaches or explain methods. He framed it as learning opportunities for the other students, which they were. When Claire solved problems, he'd ask her to explain her thinking, turning her solutions into teaching moments. The other students responded well. Kevin started sitting closer to Claire, asking her questions about the homework. A few others did the same. Slowly, she became less of a mysterious figure and more of a resource, someone they could learn from. But the biggest change was in how Professor Brennan taught. He stopped trying to humiliate students who struggled. When someone got stuck at the board, he'd help them work through it instead of making sarcastic comments. He actually seemed interested in helping people learn, Claire noticed. Everyone noticed. What happened to Professor Brennan? Kevin asked her one day after class. It's like he's a different person. Maybe he just needed a wake-up call, Claire said. 10 days after that conversation in the lecture hall, Claire made her decision. She found Professor Brennan in his office and knocked on the open door. Ms. Rodriguez, he said, looking up from his papers. Come in. I'll do the conference, Claire said without preamble. But I have conditions. Name them. We present my work, not yours. Your fluid dynamics application is secondary. The main presentation is about the methodology and its broader applications. Agreed. My name goes first on any papers we publish from this. Absolutely. And you stop calling me Ms. Rodriguez in that tone. That sounds like you're pronouncing a death sentence. Just Claire is fine. He actually smiled at that. Deal, and please call me Douglas. Professor Brennan feels too formal after all this. They shook hands, and it felt like closing one chapter and opening another. The next 5 weeks were intense. Claire and Douglas worked together almost daily, refining the presentation, developing the proofs, making sure everything was airtight. It was strange at first, working with someone after years of working alone. But Douglas was a good collaborator. He challenged her ideas, but in a productive way, helping her see angles she'd missed. And Claire got to see a different side of him. When he wasn't trying to prove something, when he wasn't performing for an audience, he was actually a talented mathematician. More than that, he was enthusiastic. He'd get excited about an elegant proof the way some people got excited about sports. "This is what I missed," he told her one afternoon as they worked through a particularly tricky section. "This feeling. Working with someone who pushes you to be better. I've been teaching for so long that I forgot what it's like to actually do mathematics with a partner." "You could have been doing it all along," Claire pointed out, "if you hadn't been so busy trying to prove you were smarter than everyone." "I know," he said quietly. "I know." The conference arrived faster than Claire expected. Suddenly she was standing in a hotel ballroom in front of about 200 mathematicians, professors, and researchers. She wore the one professional outfit she owned, a simple black suit her brother had helped her pick out. She was terrified, more nervous than she'd been in Professor Brennan's class, more nervous than she'd been writing her first paper. These were real mathematicians, people who did this for a living. What if they thought her work was obvious? What if they asked questions she couldn't answer? But Douglas was there beside her, and when she looked at him, he gave her an encouraging nod. "You've got this," he whispered. "This is your moment." Claire took a breath and began. She talked about the methodology she'd developed, the Lagrangian approach with modified boundary conditions. She explained how it could be applied to problems that traditional methods struggled with. She walked through the proofs, showed the applications, demonstrated the results, and the audience was engaged. She could see it in their faces, the way they leaned forward, the way they took notes. When she finished the main presentation, Douglas took over to discuss the fluid dynamics application, showing how Claire's method had solved a problem he'd been working on for months. Then came the questions. Claire's hands were shaking as the first person raised their hand. But the questions were good. Challenging but respectful, curious but not dismissive. These people wanted to understand her work, wanted to explore its implications. She answered each question carefully, honestly. When she didn't know something, she said so. When someone suggested an application she hadn't considered, she wrote it down to explore later. By the end, people were applauding, actually applauding, and after the presentation, at least a dozen people came up to talk to her. A professor from MIT asked if she'd considered applying for their doctoral program. A researcher from a national lab wanted to discuss collaboration opportunities. A journal editor asked if she had any new papers in the works. Douglas stood back and let her have these conversations. Later, as they were packing up, he said, "You were brilliant up there, natural, like you'd been doing this your whole life." "I was terrified," Claire admitted. "It didn't show." He helped her gather her materials. "I got an email during the question session. The department chair wants to meet with you when we get back. I think there might be a more substantial position available than just teaching assistant." Claire looked at him. "Douglas, are you trying to recruit me to stay at Riverside?" "Maybe," he said. "Would that be so terrible?" It wouldn't be, Claire realized. A few months ago, she just wanted to get her degree and leave. But now, with access to resources, with colleagues who respected her work, with the possibility of actually building a career here, staying didn't seem like settling. It seemed like the opportunity she'd been working toward. Back at Riverside, things continued to evolve. Claire accepted a position as a junior research fellow, which came with an actual salary and office space. She finished her degree, graduating with highest honors. And she kept working with Douglas, though now as a colleague rather than a student. The dynamic in his classes changed too. Other faculty noticed, and slowly the whole department started shifting. The culture of humiliation faded. Students felt safer asking questions, taking risks, admitting when they didn't understand something. One day, almost a year after that first confrontation at the board, Claire found Douglas in his office, staring at a framed copy of their conference presentation. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "How things changed." He turned to look at her. "Regret treating you better? Regret becoming a better teacher? Regret actually enjoying my work again?" He shook his head. "Not for a second. You changed my life, Claire. You reminded me why I became a mathematician in the first place." "I didn't do anything," Claire said. "I just wanted to survive your class." You did more than survive. You challenged everything I thought I knew about teaching and intelligence and worth. You showed me that brilliance doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it sits quietly in the back row, waiting for someone to actually pay attention. Claire smiled. Well, I'm not in the back row anymore. No, Douglas agreed. You're exactly where you belong, at the front leading the way. And looking at her office with her name on the door and her papers stacked on the desk and her brother's photos on the wall, Claire had to admit he was right. She'd spent so many years working in the shadows, teaching herself, proving herself to no one but herself. But now she was here in the light, doing the work she loved with people who valued it. It had been a long road, a difficult road. But standing there with her degree earned and her career beginning and her future spread out before her, Claire Rodriguez knew one thing for certain. She'd never let anyone make her feel small again. She'd learned her worth, and more importantly, she'd taught others to see it too. Sometimes the quiet ones are quiet because they already know their strength. They don't need to prove it to anyone. But when the world finally notices, when the truth finally comes out, that quiet strength becomes something undeniable, something that changes not just one person's life but everyone around them. And that, Claire thought, was the most elegant solution of all.